Sequels are a tricky business. The best of them not only manage to recapture what people enjoyed about the original, but also find ways to enhance them while effectively introducing new ideas. On paper, The Surge 2 does exactly what it should in order to achieve those goals. It's retained a lot of what worked in the first sci-fi action RPG and throws in a few solid system updates and quality of life improvements aimed at making a better version of the original. But uninspired level design, bosses, and story leave it just short of the same level of dismembering joy that the first one had. The Surge 2 takes place in the ruins of Jericho City, the closest metropolis to the ill-fated Creo complex from the original. After a mysterious plane crash that unleashed a torrent of semi-sentient machines called nanites and left the city a cordoned-off no-man's land. Though its 5 main areas all have a different look and feel, most feel like variations on the same urban wasteland template. And that's a shame because one of the things that I really appreciated about the original was that the thematic design of each zone was unique. There were some exceptions to this rule that provided a welcome break from the fairly repetitive city streets and rooftops, even if it did highlight some of the more noticeable technical issues during my playthrough in the PlayStation 4 Pro's performance mode. Mechanically, however, The Surge 2 succeeds in kicking things up a notch. The solid routine from the original remains fundamentally the same. Leave a safe zone or medbay, hack your way through a bunch of enemies to find Objective X, probably kill a boss, then find a new medbay or backtrack your way to the old one to bank your XP, level up your stats, and craft or upgrade gear using the parts you scavenged while out and about. The more enemies you kill before returning to the medbay, the higher your reward multiplier ticks, which makes staying out in the world a risk well worth taking, but if you get killed, you've got to race against a clock to find your corpse or lose everything. In addition to some cool social features, The Surge 2 introduces a wealth of new enemy types, all of which add interesting new challenges to combat encounters. From enemies who deal environmental damage to shield carriers, it's a lot more to deal with, especially in large groups. The second big change is that the standard all-purpose parry function has been replaced with a directional one, and while it did take some time to get used to, it added a new layer of challenge and complexity to each encounter. As you might imagine, tweaking all this gear led to a fair amount of agonizing over how to maximize my combo of equipment and cybernetic implants. But unlike its predecessor, The Surge 2 lets you create loadouts and swap between them at will. Having the option to jump between 3 sets of armor, weapons, and implants almost entirely eliminated the tedium of inventory management when you're gearing up for exploration or for a fight against specific enemies. All these additions to the already solid formula made the moment-to-moment combat enjoyable right up until I hit the last boss fight. That said, some of those battles weren't as thrilling as in the first Surge because they felt less like a test of my skills and more about making the same strategy work for every boss. Deflect at the right time, counterattack, and don't get one-shotted in between. They're still challenging to be sure, especially if you go for the optional dismemberments on each boss where you can rip off a new unique weapon, but as was the case in the original, these were often laughably underpowered compared to the weapon that I used to kill that boss in the first place. On the bright side, some of the late game drops actually do have stats that are comparable to your upgraded gear, and there's also been a significant increase in the sheer variety of weapons you can pick up. Of the 4 new weapon groups, I immediately gravitated toward the versatile double duty class for obvious reasons. Though I eventually abandoned them as I found more powerful weapons like the Wolverine-esque Valkyrie claws, which better fit my quick attack playstyle, but I thoroughly enjoyed them while they lasted. Story-wise, while The Surge 2 does a much better job than the original in making sure its plot is delivered when you're not in the middle of avoiding being murdered by robots, but those twists and turns were mostly predictable. It felt like the story was trying to raise the stakes too high when compared to the relatively small scale and focus of the original, especially with the addition of some RPG elements that don't really amount to anything meaningful.
You fought in the mining wars, didn't you?
Also, the first game wove in some excellent environmental storytelling, but that was in much shorter supply this time around. One thing it does better is that interactions with NPCs are all far more substantial than they were before. Almost every vendor, survivor, or other character you can interact with has their own side quest with its own rewards and/or minor consequences to the main story. The Surge 2 manages to recapture a lot of what made the original fun, even improving on its already solid combat and gear grind in several meaningful ways. Its missteps, however, make the sequel an overall lesser game than the original. Uninspired environmental design and overly ambitious story choices rob it of the same level of satisfaction, even with some smart mechanical improvements. Of course, if you're just here to chop dudes in robot suits in half as you grind up to the next power bracket or craft another piece of gear from severed arms, you're probably gonna have a good time. For more on The Surge 2, check out the first 17 minutes of the game or a boss fight in New Game Plus. And for all your other sci-fi or robot chopping needs, you're already in the right place here on IGN.